is like the opposite of Layton. Light's not on, but someone's home. All right, we are back and ready for our workshop. We've all had some wonderful nutrition. Our blood sugars are in check.
Our attitudes.
And just happy that we could extend today's meeting. Robert Layton.
It's our pleasure to be able to present this information to you.
All right. Let's get the workshop going.
All right, Mayor, thank you. As you know, we have spent, at council direction, we spent a significant amount of staff time this past year looking at our, a new source of water in response to the sales tax issue that was in front of the voters last year. It was our understanding you still want us to look at maybe a phased approach, one that would be financed through the utility, and so we're going to bring you our thoughts, the results of our work to this point, and again, not looking for any decisions on your part or even looking for consensus. We just want to show you where we are today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alan King.
Thank you, Mr. Manager. Good afternoon, Council and the Mayor. As Bob was saying, it's been a while since we've talked about this subject. We felt it was probably appropriate for us to give you an update on our current planning and thinking and some of the results of some of the analysis that we'd performed. Our previous water resources plan, the one that we've been updating, was the Integrated Local Water Supply Plan of 1993. And what we saw that as being outdated, and since that time, ASR Phase 1 and 2 had been constructed part of Phase 2, and so we've been working on updating our water resources plan. Then along came what we thought was what we considered to be the start of a severe drought, and so that accelerated our efforts to look at what are our options as far as water resource planning, and in particular drought resiliency. On September 2012, we began looking in earnest at our water resources plan. We brought an initial water supply options in October of 2013, Council adopted a drought response plan. That was huge. That was a game changer for us. With a drought response plan in place, that significantly increased the kind of drought that we could get through on the other side. We also brought an initial water supply options presented to Council back in April of 2014, and what we did was we looked at the community considered a full ASR option back at the proposed sales tax. We have a little history. As you know, we have two water supplies. One is the surface water from Cheney, and the other is groundwater from the Equisped well field. And at one point, we were using the green line here represents water that we were using out of the Equispeds. And at one time, we were 100% Equispeds water. Brought Cheney on back in about 1962 or 3, and started ramping up the amount of Cheney that we were using, and we're blending. We're using water from both sources. As we increased the reliance on Cheney, we decreased the reliance on the well field. They kind of crossed lines, if you will, back in 1994. And then in about 1997 through, say, 2013, we kind of stabilized out to roughly 60% of our water coming from Cheney Lake and about 40% of our water coming from the Equispeds. Back in just this last year, we actually made some changes in our ability to treat and some of our process changes, and we've gone to a significantly higher mix towards Cheney and much less in the Equispeds. And part of what drove that was we had extra water sitting in the reservoir that the Army Corps of Engineers allowed us to store, and that's kind of like free water, and so we wanted to make sure we had used that when it was available. And then the other part of it too is as we were starting to get ASR operational, we'll talk about that more in a minute, we wanted to try to leave the Equispeds, the aquifer, in as good a shape as possible, so we minimized our withdrawals from the aquifer. What you can see here is that demand gradually increased through the 1980s, but there's been a slowing in the rate of growth Part of that, I think, coincides with the implementation of our tiered rates. I promise you I won't talk about tiered rates other than in passing. But that was definitely a step that we took that seemed to result in a reduction in the rate of growth of our demand. And what you can also see, reflecting what the previous slide, is we've been using more and more of the green color there, more and more of Cheney and less of the Equispeds. I think it's important to note that when you look at where we're at right now, this is a notion I think that may be lost by some, and that we've come back and talked to council members over and over again. When we come to you and talk to you about water resource planning, we presently have enough water with our current water resources to last us through our planning period of 2060 without drought. In other words, if we could somehow guarantee you that we would not have a drought and from now until 2060, we don't have to do anything. With the conservation measures that we put in place and are pursuing, roughly 0.35% per year, with that added to what we have right now, we project that we'll be okay as far as meeting our demand during non-drought years all the way out through our planning period. So when we come and talk to you about additional resources, water resources, it is really only for one purpose, and that is drought protection. If there was no drought, we'd have no need. The water resources that we come and are talking to you about, the only value they have for us is in drought protection. Again, we have enough water resources presently that we can meet our demands with our new conservation targets through our planning period. Yes, sir.
Alan, on that slide that you're at, the fact that we're using less aqueous beds also means that we're replenishing the aqueous beds because we're using more Cheney?
We're taking, yes, the withdrawals from the aqueous beds are less. We are at the same time increasing our injection of new water from ASR into the aqueous beds, with the idea that during non-drought years, it's like a bank account. We put water into it and store it. It eventually, what water you put in there eventually flows out. But, I mean, we're keeping it as full as possible, kind of topped off, if you will. Now, with growth, eventually we're going to have to start taking greater and greater amounts out of the aqueous beds. But again, it's not so much of an amount that doesn't still meet all of our demands except for during drought. Drought, again, I can't emphasize this enough, is the only area that we're deficient right now as far as water supply. And so when you, to your point, Council Member, what we're doing right now is we're making as good a future as possible for drought protection by trying to keep the aqueous beds topped off. So one of the first things we looked at was what kind of a design drought do we want to plan for? State requires that you plan for a 2% drought to be eligible, for example, for state revolving fund monies and that sort of a thing. You have to show that you got a plan that at least takes into consideration a 2% drought. We asked the question some time ago. It was a policy decision, and council considered it. You know, is 2% risk averse enough, or do we really want to go for something even more risk averse and go for a 1% drought? By way of review, a 2% drought is similar to the 50s drought that we had, and a 1% drought is similar to the 1930s Dust Bowl drought that we had. The council made the decision that if it is possible, you would prefer that we come up with a plan that makes us able to get through a 1% drought. That's our planning drought, and that's the efforts that we've been going through. And so if you look at that bright white line, it shows that for a 1% drought, we just left the when we can get through a 1% drought. That time is gone, but we still have a little bit of time, almost 2025, before what we can get through a 2% drought. So if you had chose a 2% drought, we'd still have a little bit of time left. But because you chose a 1% drought, we need to start looking at new water resources now. You look at this over time, as you can see, the demand is the orange line, and that grows over time, and the supply pretty much stays even. So as you can see, as time goes along, the gap between those increases. Well, one of the things I mentioned earlier was with the new water conservation approach that we're taking, we can use the current water resources and meet non-drought years all the way out through our planning period. It's an important point that we can't just get our way out of the less expensive way for this is not just adding so much new water resources that we get ourselves out of any kind of a risk from a drought. Really the smart economic way is to couple both new water resources and some kind of a conservation. And so we're realizing some level of conservation, have been for some time, and we decided that what we needed to do was to target a 0.35% conservation, and those are the sorts of things we've been doing here for the last few years. The water rebate program targeted and reached and met those targets for that kind of water conservation. We're looking at the potential for water reuse for some of our industrial users to meet some of that kind of water conservation. So what we're looking at is daily water use in January through February per capita. We're actually doing pretty good, but I think we have to make sure that we look at 2014 and 2015 as the wet years that they were and not get too carried away by those results. So we decided that we needed to look at new water supply. We wanted to make sure that we used the best data that was available, that we thought was available, that we brought in the best experts that we could. So we brought in engineers, PEC, High Country Hydrology, SAIC, Burns and McDonnell. We brought in economists, water tech consultants, and water DM. And we used information from the U.S. Geological Survey, from Colorado State University. And as far as growth projections, we actually used the Metro Area Planning Department, not only for the city of Wichita itself, but the communities that we also serve. We added the projected growth for those as well. So what we wanted to do is to try to pull together the best data that was available and use some of the best consultants on the subject. Again, when we look at the 1% drought, demand versus supply, the first step in the process was to determine the future water demands, and we did that. We came up with what we think the water demands would be, but we thought, boy, that's steep and the gap's too big, so we added the 0.35% target, and as you can see, that green line, it blunts down the future growth. That's the contribution in drought protection that having some level of conservation added to your plan provides you. As you can see, the gap is considerably less when you add to it that intentional conservation. Now what you do is you look at the gap between that new reduced demand line and what you have available in a 1% drought, both from Cheney and the Equus beds, and what you have to fill in is the orange area. That's the new water supply. So you only add the water supply that's going to meet your objectives, which is to bridge the gap between the demand blunted by conservation and the water supplies that you have. Yes, sir.
Does that take into account drought effect on Cheney?
Absolutely. In other words, when you're looking at the total water that's available here over time, those lines represent a 1% drought, so that it takes into consideration evaporative loss in Cheney, the amount of water we take from Cheney. It takes into consideration what you'd be doing as far as the Equus beds was concerned. You're not going to be adding a lot of groundwater treated from ASR into the ground during those drought years, because you presume that there's not going to be water in the river to treat.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Well, on this chart, the orange line in the out years, basically, does that say that you need to find 10 million gallons a day?
That's right. That's right. That's the gap that you're trying to fill. So, looking at it kind of as a transactions here, you have. Let's see, where am I?
Or save 10 million gallons a day.
Some combination, yeah.
Some combination.
In addition to what we're already saying that we're going to say. So you're going to grow by some amount, we hope. That will increase your demand. But what we want to do is reduce the amount of that increased demand, even with population growth, with user base growth, even with that growth, blunt that increase by conservation. Now, we think that 0.35% per year, that's pretty aggressive. We want to be conservative in our approach and not assume that we can achieve all what we need to do to meet that gap all through conservation. We want to have our plan conservative enough that we think we can achieve 0.35%, and probably what we're going to need to do is to make up the difference through new water sources. And that's the roughly 10 million gallons a day that we're talking about. That's what we have. That's the gap that we have to bridge.
I won't ask you more questions since you had the answer on the next slide.
Sure. Hey, I do have
Is that a
one
promise?
question.
Captain Obvious.
Is that a promise?
Yeah, Captain Obvious. Hold on here. So if you look at our last 2 years of usage, and I know it's only 2 years of usage, it looks like we've been under 50 million gallons a day. If you look at our total usage over the last 2 years, which takes you all the way back to page 4, and I know that's not broken out very well. It's hard to read the last 2 years on there, but you've got, and of course, 2015 is not complete, so I don't know, your data was up to third quarter, I don't know.
We projected 2015, recognizing that it's probably the worst water sales year we've had in 40 years? Since the early 90s.
Our conservation's working.
Well, probably
Mother Nature is.
yes,
Mother Nature has dumped on us all.
that part of our conservation that is from rainfall coming out on the
But even going back from there, we've been well under 60 million gallons a day.
And you're right, and you're seeing kind of the variability, the seasonal variability that weather represents. If you were to kind of try to draw a smooth line, a best fit through there, what you'd see is that kind of that smooth graph line that we're showing what it is we've been experiencing. It does have a slight downward trajectory,
Right.
and then we have the upward pressure of additional population growth and usage. That takes us to a higher line, and then we add this 0.35
Sure,
per year,
which smooths it
gets us
back down.
Exactly.
But I
It's
guess
not
my
flat, but it's
my only point, Alan, on all of your charts showing projections, all of them start at 60 million gallons a day. If they started at 50 million gallons a day, how much time does that buy us?
so. Well, to make our plan, the assumptions in our plan conservative enough, we want to make sure that we start at 60 million gallons a day because it's in a drought. And at the beginning of the drought, people are going to be using a lot of water. What we see in the
You're
first
really showing drought scenario
yes.
for the entire.
Every time you see that
Progression.
demand growth, yes. Every time you
It's
see that
drought
demand growth,
scenario only.
yes, that's correct. Not what we're going to expect to see. Because remember earlier in the conversation, if we weren't in a drought, we got enough water already. But when you find yourself in a drought, then you got to start doing your drought, your water, identifying what kind of water resources you're going to need to meet that drought. And so in each one of these that shows these demand graphs, they're showing what the demand would be in a 1% drought, assuming that it's
Okay.
going to be hot and dry for those first couple of years, and people are going to be doing a lot of watering. So with our analysis, we think that even with the intentional conservation, we're still going to need to come up with about 10 million gallons a day, 9.5. Now, one of the things that helps us a lot, that really was a game changer for us, was Council's approval of the drought response plan. Even in a 1% drought, without adding additional water resources, it shows that the demand outstrips supply. But because you've put in place a drought response plan, we can still make it through that 1% drought. We can still get to the other side of it without running out of water. But I'll tell you, in the later stages, you start getting into some fairly severe restrictions. Particularly, you look at, so stage 1 is it's voluntary conservation. That's between 70 and 90% of the smoothed average of the level in Cheney. And this is a review for, I know, for all you folks. Stage 2, now you're allowing outdoor watering only 1 day per week. That's a change. In other words, now, folks, we're going to require you to, instead of just voluntarily conserving, now we're going to require you to reduce the amount that you water outdoors to 1 day per week. Now, as you start getting into stage 3 and stage 4, now you're talking about all outdoor watering ban, except for where there's a commercial use. And in stage 4, all outdoor watering ban, and even a reduction inside individual businesses and homes of 15%. It's much more severe as you get into stage 3 and to stage 4. But as Cheney level goes lower and lower, you find yourself further and further into the drought. These are the kinds of steps that you put in place as you are as the drought is unfolding for you. That gives you some kind of a chance of getting through to the end of the drought and not running out of water. Well, that was a game changer for us, so that now we can survive a 1% drought. Wouldn't be particularly pleasant, but we could survive. We would not face the prospect of an empty reservoir and no water for when people turned on their taps. Now, when we were looking at drought response planning, what our goal was to take our current drought response plan and look at various scenarios of adding some sort of water or the way that we use our water, and see if there was some way for us to not go any further than stage 2. In other words, we think a successful drought response or water resource plan would, when you get into a 1% drought, the worst thing that happens to you is people are restricted to watering their lawn once a week. That's pretty, let that soak in a little bit, When there are other communities that have run out of water, that have empty wells, that are facing crisis, and we've seen some examples in recent history of what that looks like in a severe drought. And what we're trying to achieve with our drought response strategy is, with the right amount of water added and the way that we operate, we can have no worse than telling folks that they have to water their lawn only once a week during the most 30s Dust Bowl style drought. I would argue, and maybe others would agree, that that might be quite an incentive for someone to consider Wichita if in a drought-prone area, part of the country, we have a plan that through our planning period takes into consideration the most severe drought, and the worst that you can expect is that you'll have to restrict your watering to once a week. And that's a very lofty goal, but that's what we've been shooting for. So if we look at ASR, because it fits into this drought response, the strategy that we're working on, I wanted to bring you an update on ASR. ASR has been a real challenge. We finished it and got ready to commission it right at the beginning of a severe drought. That was a challenge, and we've been working through that. And there has been from time to time some perhaps misinformation, or at least confusing information or contrasting information out for folks that they're looking at and considering. What I thought might be helpful is to give you an update of what's actually happening with ASR, because that represents a significant investment that the council has made. When you look at just the ASR plan itself, it's $154 million, I think, without the transmission lines and the streets and everything else. So when you look at commissioning a site, a treatment plant, there's these shakeout days, as they call it. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to compare a facility of this level of complexity. This is a fairly complex facility when you look at what it does. We wanted to look at what the shakeout period was for facilities of the same type. And the average low end, we saw that with facilities of about this complexity, their shakeout period was anywhere between 90 and 270 days of operation. In other words, you operate it for that number of days to get all the things right. And there's something this complicated. There's equipment that fails. You have to have spares. You have to have workarounds. You have to have new redundancy. You identify things that just weren't quite right when they were designed or when they were installed. You have this period of time called shakeout days. And what we found out was that when there was water in the river with the right chemistry so that we could treat it, that what we did is we took advantage of those days and used them to shake it out. And we got to this number of days, 30 in 2013, another 23 in 2014. It was during that drought time. We started getting better in 2023 or in 2014. In 2015, we finished up. As you can see, our shakeout period was relatively short compared to other facilities, but we had to break it over years because it was only we were only able to do it when there was water in the river. So when you look at kind of before and after, we've been evaluated by what the performance has been during this shakeout period. You're not running every time you can run, and you're not running at full capacity. If you look at if you look at the the potential hours to run prior to the shakeout, we had 668 hours that we could run, but we only ran at 400 hours of those 668 hours, which is only 60%. That's not inconsistent with what it looks like when you're still in shakeout. After shakeout, we were up to 91%. That's about the number that we use in our projections. You recall that we came in, we looked at what the projections were for production at the plant up there, and we said, it's not going to be 9 or 10, 11,000. It's going to be something more like 5,800. And we reduced significantly the projected output from the treatment plant. What we're finding now is that's consistent with our reduced projections. They seem to be holding true. And so when you look at quantity, prior to shakeout, there was the potential for 724 million gallons, and we only produced 250 million gallons, or 35%. And there were some who were really seizing on 35% and saying, see, look at these guys, they still don't have it right. But after shakeout, what you can see is of the 633 million gallons that were available, we produced 573 million gallons, or about 90%. And 90%, again, was one of the numbers we used in our assumptions and our revised output estimates, knowing that you don't get a full 30 million gallons of treated water out. You pull in 30 million gallons a day, but you have some of it that has to be wasted because you don't get 100% treatment for all the water. And that number is consistent with the assumptions that we were using in our estimated reduced production for the ASR plant. So all of this is to say that once we got past the shakeout period, now that we have a period of time that we actually have the thing running like we know it's supposed to run, during the time when the water's available both in the level in the river and the chemistry that has the right levels, not too much bromide, not too much atrazine, during those windows that we can run, we're running at about 90%, which is what we thought we'd run. And so the assumptions that we made, we feel comfortable still holding. And when you look at what that looks like prior to shakeout and after shakeout, with when we're running 100%, you want to try to run 100%. It's just about every day that it's available, and then on days that it's not available, you're either down for routine maintenance, back flushing filters, things that you plan on doing, and and what we're seeing is that after shakeout is fairly consistent with what we had estimated and planned. The other piece of information that sometimes is used out there that isn't particularly helpful is someone will look at the rainfall and say, well, look at these months that you had all this rain. Why aren't you producing more at ASR? Well, sometimes there's a difference between rainfall amount, total amount, and when the water's available in the river. And here's a couple of examples. The low rainfall 1967 example, the orange shows days of operation. If we were able to operate in 1967 with the treatment plant that we have now, with the parameters that we have now, we'd be able to run 114 days, which is over the kind of the average days of 80. And that's only a year that only had 23 inches of rain, below the average inches of rain of 30. So in other words, here's an example where you have less rain than average, but you'd be able to run the facility at more days, more than average. So rainfall isn't a very good gauge on whether or not you're hitting your targets with ASR. The next example over is a high rainfall year, 2013. You're getting 40 inches of rain above the average of 30 inches of rain, but you're only hitting 67 operating days, million-gallon operating days, because of the way that the rain hits. So it could be that it's hitting in a different place. It could be hitting in such a way that it's filling the river very fast, and there's a whole bunch of water on top of what you have that's usable, that's running past. There could be it could be washing the fields and putting atrazine levels too high in the water. In other words, what I'm saying is we really need to base how ASR is operating on what we're seeing on actually hours of operation and production. And what we're seeing is after shakeout, it's hitting the target. And that these kind of proxy approaches that have been used by some, like looking at rainfall and drawing a conclusion that it's not operating like it should, this is an example of showing you why rainfall is not an indication on how well you should or should not be doing with ASR. Okay, let's talk about ASR's contribution. Here's this graphic that shows the blue line is the smooth average of Cheney Reservoir. It is the line that triggers the different phases of our drought response plan. So as you can see, as you're beginning, and this is a 1% drought we're looking at here. As you can see, you start out, and then as you get into 2007, now you're hitting down below 90%, and that yellow band in stage 1. What we're seeing in the reservoir has now triggered stage 1 of our drought response plan, voluntary conservation only. As you get further into the drought, you see that we get into stage 2. Now it's 1 day per week of watering your lawn. You get a little bit further and you get into stage 3 for a little while, and in a typical kind of a drought, there's generally some kind of a rebound of some amount of diminished rainfall, and you bounce back out into stage 2 only to find yourself back into stage 3 again later on. This is what it looks like without ASR today, with a 1% drought. But with ASR, what you see is with ASR operating as it is now without any improvements, it's taken out that first incursion into stage 3 and shortened the incursion into stage 3 of the second one. So in other words, we're already realizing some benefit from ASR in its current format as far as the severity of what our drought response plan would look like if we found ourselves in a 1% drought. We're already realizing a drought response benefit from our current ASR in its current configuration without any improvements. But you know, if we didn't have ASR, I showed you that small incursion into stage 3 and then a longer one. This is what it looks like without ASR going out to the end of our planning period. What you would have seen, and this is the graph that we showed you quite some time ago, it doesn't look good. Without ASR going all the way out to our planning period, we find ourselves with a significant amount of time in stage 4. So we have the full ASR improvements presented last year. It's still an option. In other words, when we were looking at some $200 to $250 million from the sales tax initiative, if that money were available, we could build what we called the full ASR option, bring it all the way to the maximum production at one time, because that's when the funding was available at one time. That's still an option that is available, but we would have to come up with that amount of money all at once over a 5-year period of time. But what we also looked at was we wanted to revisit the work that we did with the El Dorado option. El Dorado worked with us to identify at least a couple of different ways that they could provide water to the city to help us with our drought response plan. So we wanted to relook at the assumptions that we had at the time that back a couple years ago. And then what we also wanted to look at was, well, if we don't have this one-time influx of money and we want to do something in kind of a phased approach and fund it out of rates, what would that look like? So that's been the work over the last year since we've talked to you all about this before. So what we did is we had some questions about how would El Dorado Reservoir actually perform in not a drought of record, but a 1% drought, and there is a difference between those terms. Sometimes people use those interchangeably. There is a drought of record that could be used in looking at El Dorado. We wanted to look at our 1% design drought. So imposing conditions on El Dorado for our 1% design drought, we came up with we had high country hydrology, world-class experts on this sort of thing, come up with what the reservoir level would be in El Dorado. We also met with El Dorado, and they were kind enough to share with us their proposed drought response plan, not unlike what it is that we have. In other words, as the levels start getting lower, you start having some behaviors to affect what the demands you're going to experience. And we put that on, we superimposed that onto this and looked at the 25% stage 3 goal of 25% demand reduction by banning outdoor water use. We didn't try to evaluate whether we thought it was reasonable or not. We just took what it is that were their assumptions. We also took into consideration a not to exceed 9 million gallons per day for El Dorado demand. In other words, if El Dorado didn't add another single customer, or if they only added customers by what amount that they could realize in conservation, that they never went higher than 9 million gallons a day. That's what this graph shows. Also, the 10 million gallons a day that we would be looking at, Wichita would be looking at, and then whether the minimum flow downstream was required or not. And there's some question by some on whether or not you'd be able to get the regulators to agree to a permanent, or rather a zero downstream flow throughout the entire 1% drought. But assuming that we could get the regulators to agree with that, what you can see is that just before the end of the drought, of the 1% drought, you're at about empty. You're at about with zero water left in the reservoir. And so, there's still some questions that we've been talking with El Dorado on whether they'd be willing to let their water level go to zero, or whether they'd want to hold some amount of water back for their own drought protection purposes. Any amount of water that would be held back for them, and that wouldn't be unreasonable for them to do that, would shorten the length of time that we'd be able to get the 10 million gallons to less than the duration of the 1% design drought. So we did take some time and re-look at the assumptions that were needed for us to look at the benefit of water available in the last part of the drought. El Dorado, like us, has more water than they need during most of the year. They spill water like we spill water. So there's years where they have more water than they need, certainly adequate water. But like us, during the drought years, that's the time when the water's at its premium. The value of El Dorado water is only in those last 1 or 2 years of the drought. There is no value to the city of that water during regular non-drought years. It's just water that we already have anyway, and it's expensive water. It's more expensive than the water that we presently have in our existing resources. So for us, the value then only becomes, can you give us 10 million gallons a day at the last year or two of the drought? And that's where we very narrowly focus our attention on, is that water available at the time, the only time that we need that water. One of the other things that our consultant looked at was, well, what about the behavior of the reservoir? Is there something about El Dorado that could make it act differently and in such a way that could provide us value other than what we look at as far as a drought model concerned? And one of the things they looked at was their best guess as far as the conservation pool. They have even more water in their conservation pool than we do at Cheney. It's just a little bit, but it is more than what we have. But the other thing they looked at was the size of the drainage area. When you look at the size of the drainage area in terms of square miles, Cheney has a 664 square mile drainage area, where El Dorado has a 234 square mile drainage area. Drainage area is important because that's the area that if you do get some rainfall, it's over that area that you're collecting the rain that it can run in and refill the reservoir. So that was one of the things that was looked at in the study. So we thought, okay, we've done do all ASR all at once, still on the table if we want to come up with 200 to 220 or 250 million dollars, or we want to make sure we look at El Dorado again when we're not in kind of the heat of the short timelines and what have you. And then the other thing was, well, what if we don't have either of those options available to us? What if we have to come up with something that is paid for out of rates? And so what we decided to look at was a phased approach. This is a 6-phase approach, with the first 3 phases not costing us anything. In other words, if we're going to go with the ASR approach, there are 3 phases that we can do without adding any capital investment and yet improving the performance of our asset up there. With the first phase being optimization, and that's what we're doing right now, is to make sure that we can increase the window size of when that water is available, either because of our ability to treat water that has higher bromide levels or higher atrazine or a combination of both, and we've been working on that. Elevation adjustment, we're looking at the 1993 level in the aquifer, which has been something that's been in place as part of the condition of ASR getting its right. And what we realize that the value of ASR is putting water into the aquifer in excess of the 40,000 acre feet that we presently have as our water right there in the well field, that as you get towards the end of the drought, you're going to have to pull less and less from Cheney and more from the well field. And in order to do that, we still have this limitation of 40,000. We can't go over that legally. And so the only way we can do that is having additional water rights available to us. Well, we're assuming that by the time you get into that kind of a drought, the water table in the aquifer has dropped down to a lower level. If at the very time we need that extra water, we are at that lower level, and the state's telling us that we can't have access to that water, there's no incentive for us to put that water into the ground for drought protection. It's good for future demands. Someday we'll need to be able to use that past 2060 for future demands. But for drought protection, which is the new refocus of our efforts, we need to assume that the water level in the aquifer has dropped during those drought years. And at the very time that we need that extra water over our 40,000, that's when we need to be able to pull that extra ASR credits. So we've made that case to the state and said to the state, you really need to change the regulations and give us the access to that water below the 93 level, because then we're incentivized to put that water in the aquifer, to keep it capped off, to keep it in good shape, and they see the win-win in it. They see that, yes, it's in everybody's interest to incentivize the city to put that water in there, and the reason why we would want to do that is so that we have some belief that it's going to be available at the end of the drought, and that's below the 1993 level. And so we're on track right now in conversations with the state. When is the hearing supposed to be? The hearing that's going to... January 11th. So we're real close, January 11th, to having the hearing, which is the last formality before they make the regulation change. So we're that close to getting the 1993. We've been doing some work in the meantime. That's going to be huge for us, because that really adds to our drought resiliency without adding any new equipment, without adding any new water right, only being able to take the water in a different way in a different time. That's what we mean by these no-cost options.
All right, hold on. Two things there. And one of them should be an argument that I would think would help us make that case on January 11th. When you look at the shift of water usage from source, and now there's a period now where we're only taking about 10% at times in extreme conditions, 10% from the equus beds. What does that 10% equate to the total water usage out of the equus beds? Because it's my understanding that in a typical average year, we're only taking about 50% of the water that's pulled out of the equus beds. So if we're only taking 10%, what does that do to the percentages of the water consumed from the equus beds?
That's a very good point. In other words, what is the value of only taking 10%? It's not just like in the Ogallala aquifer, just you're depleting it at a slower rate. The equus beds, fortunately for us, has a recharge, a natural recharge of about 29 million gallons a day. So there's water during normal years coming into the aquifer. If we reduce the amount that we're pulling out of there, the net result is that the water level actually increases. And that's what we've been seeing as we've been taking lower and lower amounts out. That natural recharge has put it to a place now where I think it's about 96% full. So it increases the health of the aquifer.
But my point is, we are now the minority water user out of those equus beds. But yet we are the only entity that's recharging out of the natural recharge at the tune of about $250 million on the backs of our ratepayers. And so, can we make the argument that we're only 20% of the water pulled from those equus beds, but we're 100% of the cost of putting those waters back in?
Yeah, the answer to your question is yes. The way that we present it is that if you allow us to take water when we need it, which is during the drought, the heavy draw, this is what it looks like during normal years. Look at what we're doing. We're keeping the aquifer full and healthy and pushing back to the extent we can the chloride migration. This is how we operate in normal years. We are incentivized to do this even though it's at our cost. Right. We're incentivized to do this because in the bad years of the drought, then we're going to.
Protection. So that's my next point. How much protection does that give us? How many years would that give us in a drought situation if we're successful at receiving those credits?
I can get that number. I don't have that number off the top of my head, but it is measured in months and years as far as the benefit. In other words, as part of our total 10 million gallons, that is a significant part of that total 10 million gallons. I can find out what the percentage of that 10 million gallons is.
Because have you plugged that scenario into your projections, assuming we're going to be successful?
Yes.
So it's already plugged into your.
When I showed you the graphs that showed what it looks like with ASR, that was with that 93 level included in there. So we're assuming we're going to get that 93 level.
Like a person with confidence.
Well, come back to me after January, I suppose. But everything we're hearing from the state is because they get it. They understand that this is in everybody's interest, not just the city's interest. So they want to incentivize us to do the right thing that benefits everybody, not just the city. And so this is not a hard sell.
This would be a good time just to recognize that one of the big changes from this time last year when we were talking about this is we have two very strong partners, the Corps of Engineers in terms of what they're allowing us to do in taking water out of Cheney, and the state of Kansas who's allowing us to look at the operational credits. And without that, we would be in a very different situation, back to the same projections that we had a year ago. So that's really kind of, those two factors alone have changed the scenery.
That was a great segue to the third no-cost effort that we're making, and that is to get credit for operational credits. Again, one of the things that those who look at a very kind of shallow level at the data and want to analyze what the efficiency of ASR is, one of the things that they don't have access to is the amount of water that we don't put into the ground. We're required to report that, and so that's available to anybody who wants to look for it. But we also send water to town. When we've maxed out our wells and we're still in a production mode, what we do is we take that extra water that we can't stick into the ground today, instead of just shutting down, what we do is we send that water to town instead of pumping it out of the Equisbeds.
Keeps us from pulling from the Equisbeds.
There you go, exactly. So it further reduces the amount that we're pulling out of the Equisbeds, and what we're doing is we're sending that water to town to do that. Now, that's a benefit right there. What if we could get ASR credits for that water that we don't put in the ground? In other words, the argument we're making is, why make us put it into the ground and then just pull it out the next day? Why make us do that? Why not just give us that same credit because it's water we're not taking out of the the well field? Why don't you just give it so that in the future, when we have a drought, we can count on those credits in addition to what water's below 93? That's also a significant improvement, and we're in conversations with the state. We want to make sure we get through the 93 level piece first. That's critical. But this operational credits, although it isn't 100% accounted for in our model, that would be on top of and in addition to what we're trying to do here that would make our situation even better.
Right. I would love to see some projections. I mean, you're showing the worst of years in drought conditions. Would love to see some projections under maybe average or above average years. We know that the Equisbeds have gone to whatever they were to 96% full in a fairly short amount of time with both natural recharge and ASR.
And reduced use by us.
And reduced use. What would happen if we would have 5 more decent years? Could we get to 100% charge in the Equisbeds? And then what does that look like going forward if the Equisbeds are at 100% full?
That is the right next thing to look at. We are working with the state and with the GMD2 to look at the possibility of modeling, even in good years, not just in drought years, what the behavior is going to be there. And really, to look at that, what you're describing, you can't just look at the area of our well field. You have to look at a broader area of the Equus because they're connected hydrologically.
Absolutely.
And so the state is right now leading the charge to try to do just exactly that. We're very supportive of that and very curious about what that could look like, and maybe opportunities for us to even refine our operations a little bit more to take advantage of what's going on outside the well field. So you're right, that is the next step for us to go down. So then there's the operational credits. Then there's phase 4, which are diversion wells. And of the ASR, the full ASR option, we looked at what's going to give us the biggest bang for the buck early on. And it's putting these wells into the river bank. They're drawing from the river. They're not wells in the sense that they're pulling from the aquifer. They're pulling from the bank storage that's on the river. But you can do that, and even when the river flows are lower than what you'd be able to take them into our intake into our plant, and we can take that increases the number of days we can pull water out of the river and treat it. So that's going to be the next thing we want to look at, is the possibility of sometime in the future drilling some extra wells, but in the bank itself, diversion wells. Following that, we want to rehabilitate some of our existing wells so that not only are they getting older and have to be rehabilitated just because of that, but what about taking some of these that are only irrigation wells that pull water out, and when we rehabilitate them, make them so that they are also injection wells to increase the footprint of where we can inject water into, increase the amount of water that we can store in there. And then finally, constructing new wells. That's the short-term next steps of a phased approach. And those last 4, those actually have costs associated with them. So this is really kind of a description of what we just talked about, and I won't go over that again. But what I can say is, if we take these steps over a phased approach and put them in place, where this gets us is at the end of our planning period in 2060, if we have these steps in place, both the regulatory and the capital improvements, what it looks like is in a most severe drought, a 1% drought, we don't get into phase 3. We stay in phase 2 only. Kind of like what I was saying at the beginning. In a drought-stricken area with a history of being having drought, our plan will look like worst thing that happens, we have a Dust Bowl drought, and if you live in Wichita, you'll have to water your lawn just once a week. That's achievable with the plan that we're presenting to you. So when you look at our short-term phase plan, the first 3, there's no costs associated with them. The diversion wells, we think it's going to be somewhere around $11 to $12 million. Rehabilitate the existing recharge wells, about another $11 million. We probably have to do that anyway because of the age of the wells themselves. So it's a cost that contributes to our efforts, but it's a cost we have anyway, just continuing the operation. And then constructing new recharge wells, about another $47 million. So those are the costs that you're looking at in the future, but we can do it over time. So when you look at the white line was what we were looking at when we were thinking of a full $250 million over 5 years to build everything that ASR could ever be. In other words, go to zero risk immediately. That's kind of a nice place to be. What we're suggesting is you move your risk out into the future, always just kind of staying ahead of it, rather than kind of the more enviable position is just get it all done, taken care of. You don't have to worry about anything from now out until 2060. The approach we're talking about is no decisions are going to have to be made to continue to do things that push the risk out into the future each time that the next step needs to be taken, and that's what the green line is. So you see the gap in billions of dollars and that's total operating costs of the green line that we're bringing to you to consider versus the white line is what we were looking at with the zero risk right away option of the $250 to $200 million approach of full ASR. The orange line is the El Dorado. El Dorado is always competitive with the full ASR approach that we were looking at. Some would argue that it was even more competitive, less total life cycle costs. There was just a concern and a question at the time anyway about whether the water would really be there when we needed it. And so that's why we followed on with some additional search. And then there's one other thing too, is that we always knew that we were going to have to build a pipeline. a parallel pipeline from the well field to our treatment plant. And the reason for that is in those last years of the drought, when we're going to be taking all 40,000 acre feet of our water in the well field, our native right that we have now, and this additional ASR credit water that we're accumulating, particularly that below the 93 level, we can't push that much water through the pipeline that we have now. We need to build a parallel pipeline to take advantage of that. And so that is in our future someday. Even with growth, we're going to have to build that someday. But here's the other side benefit of having that parallel pipeline. Right now, something happens to that pipeline. It's like 50 years roughly old. And we're trying to kind of make repairs to it as we can. But if that should fail, that's a single point failure. And if that should fail, we have no water from the well field for some period of time, as long as it takes to repair it. And depending on the failure, it could be months, it could be up to a year, depending on the kind of failure that we experience. Having a parallel pipeline builds redundancy. So it not only meets future peak demands that we're going to have to do anyway, but it also gives us access to that extra water we would be pulling out of the Equus fields, and it gives us the redundancy that we would like to have for the operation of our system. So we're thinking that the green line's probably the smart approach as far as new water supply. It's the lowest life cycle costs. So what does that look like? Oops. So this is what our historical rate increases have been. And that's percent on the y-axis. This is what we project into the future without adding any drought resiliency, just to do what we've been talking about earlier today. If you wanted to, over some period of time, make rate increases, and the scale on this is every line is 2%, to give you some kind of an idea about what that scale is if you can't read it from here. If you wanted to add, in addition to the rate increases that we need to operate into the future to cover this phased approach, it's those orange lines right there. So for some period of time, some relatively modest increases above what we're already projecting could get us to where we're talking about with this phased approach. If we want to add on top of that the pipeline, because that is going to be a necessary requirement sometime in the future, if not for drought protection, just to cover our ability to handle peak demands in the future, now you're really kind of stretching that out a few more years. And that's the rate impact that we're talking about, worst case for us, to be able to meet the kind of targets that we've laid out, not going any further than stage 2 in a drought, in a 1% drought, all the way out to 2060, our planning period. So if you look at the final year water supply rate increase in 2024, what you're looking at is for the rate impact for residential customers, kind of broken out the same way that we always show you. The additional impact would be this 9% total increase. You look at a residential and a commercial customer. When you look at what the Wichita expected amount would be with these rate increases versus what we think the national average is going to be, and we're taking the numbers that were provided to us by our consultant, that we are not only are we looking at future rate increases, I would argue relative to our peers smaller than those that are in the 50 largest cities, but they are also going to have to look at rate increases, and when you look at where we will be into the future, this is how we compare. So this is kind of the exciting long range. If only I should live long enough to see all of this. Right now we have two sources of water, Cheney Lake and the Equus beds. And the stuff that's in orange, that's existing. So we have an existing pipeline that goes from the Equus beds down to our main water treatment plant. That exists too. And we have an existing pipeline that goes from Cheney Lake to the main water treatment plant. And that's the way that the two sources of water get to our main water treatment plant. Our main water treatment plant is at the end of its useful life. We're going to have to start thinking about what we're going to do to upgrade it. We're already looking at some fairly significant improvements that have already come before council. But what I would like to see is that someday in the future, maybe not that far in the future, we start looking at past these improvements to get through drought. We look at on our Northwest treatment site, building our Northwest Treatment Facility and building it big enough that we can operate off the Northwest facility and take certain portions of our main water treatment plant offline to rebuild them. In other words, it's always a difficult when you're trying to rebuild a site in place while it's operational. Our Northwest Treatment Site is part of our long-range plan to meet our demands and what we need to build anyway. But if we build it and sequence it in such a way, we can have it in place that allows us to be able to make the improvements that we have to eventually make in our main water treatment plant. Then building the parallel pipeline to the Equus beds. That would be something that's going to be able to get us to the end of our drought period in 2060 and still be drought resilient. It also gives us that redundancy on that that single pipeline that comes from the Equus beds. Then rehabilitate the existing pipelines and the treatment plant itself. Start working on rehabilitating that with the idea that eventually what we're going to do is build a pump station to take the water that we presently spill from Cheney. That's water that we're spilling now. Take the water that we're presently spilling from Cheney and pump that up to ASR, to the Equus beds, and have yet additional water that we can store up in the Equus beds. Not only would that make sense as far as that's water that we're presently spilling and that we could use similar to water that's being spilled at El Dorado being sent to the ASR if that was an option that we were to consider. But this is water that we already basically are spilling and that we could use. The Army Corps is good with that. But the other part of it too is we also build the appurtenances that we need to be able to have redundant pipeline from Cheney to the main water treatment plant. That's the thing that keeps me awake at night, is that pipeline. If that pipeline goes, that's the only pipeline that we can meet the greatest amount of demands is from that pipeline. We're going to have to do something serious about it anyway. If we build ourselves a parallel pipeline, it gives us the luxury to make staged improvements and repairs to the existing pipeline. The other thing that it does is it gives us, when we rebuild this treatment plant at the Northwest site, this treatment plant that allows us to make the repairs, we're considering making that a reverse osmosis treatment plant so that if in the long future that salt intrusion starts coming into the well field to the point where others are no longer able to use it for irrigation, I mean, someday, way in the future, that's going to happen. That's not going to harm us. It's not going to hurt us. We're first through blending and then through reverse osmosis. We can take that brackish water from the Equus beds, treat it, blend it with our other water source from Cheney, and we can go ahead and continue to operate even with brackish water in the Equus beds. So that's our long range plan and how it all fits into what we're talking about here. So with that, if you have any additional questions, that's the end of staff's presentation.
I can't imagine that you haven't already worn us out.
Real quick,
Yes.
on slide 25, on the last bullet point under phase 3, it says could eliminate need for $47 million in new recharge wells. But yet, you're still showing it on page 27. So that worst case scenario, that if that doesn't happen, you still have it plugged in as the phase 6. Is that the same $47 million?
Worst case. Well, if this really has to do. Yes, we still have to put those some wells in, but we could put in fewer wells if we have this operational credits. It's the change in the how we count the operational credits, but we could reduce the number of wells if the state agrees with us on the operational credits.
Just want to make sure I was understanding it correctly. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, just a quick comment or clarification. I know that we're working on some purple pipe projects and reuse. Didn't hear a whole lot about reuse in this presentation. I just want to reiterate that is still a pretty big, I think, going to be a need and necessity to look at. Thanks a lot. And I hope that we continue to work with companies on some purple pipe issues, and I know that you know that I'm passionate about that. But just the more that we can reuse, the better that all of this looks as well. So.
Right, that's part of our conservation strategy, and we've talked about that, and we will be talking more about that.
Thank you, Alan. Anything else, Robert?
No, we'll continue to talk to you about this as we get further developments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That concludes today.